This lecture is about language, and there are a few components of language that I want to talk about in this lecture. The first area is the characteristics of language, and then I want to talk about the power of language, and finally a couple of usages of language for you to keep in mind. In talking about the characteristics of language, the first characteristic is that language is symbolic. And that means that it is a collection of sounds to form a word, and these words are intended to represent things and ideas. It is this representation dynamic that makes language symbolic. Words are learned and given meaning by those who use them. So we agree, as users of the language, that certain words mean certain things, but words are symbols. The second characteristic of language is that language is arbitrary. And this means that we call a table, but we could just as easily have called it a grundle or a cho rate or anything else that complies with our sound rules in the language. The fact that we call it a table doesn't mean anything. There's no inherent meaning to the collection of sounds that form the word table. It's simply arbitrary. We could have called it anything else. The third characteristic of language is that it is rule-governed. We don't typically see the rules until they're broken. For example, we can say the boy kicked the ball. Fine. But as soon as I try to say the ball kicked the boy, there's a problem. And you recognize that either I don't know what I'm talking about or I have some very strange and scary ball. The fourth characteristic of language is that it has layers of meaning. And that means that there are certain implications that go deeper than the surface language usage. For example, I can utter a phrase and it will mean one thing on its surface, but there are innuendos or alternate meanings that can go beneath the surface that other people might interpret from this collection of words that I've used. So in that way, language has layers of meanings. It can mean one thing directly, denotatively, and it can mean many, many other things indirectly, or connotatively, or under the surface. Language is also inherently ambiguous. Many words have multiple meanings. Pronouns are unclear. Language is simply ambiguous. That is one of the dynamics of language. Any language, every language. It's ambiguous. So we do our best to represent our ideas through careful word choices and careful grammar, but it's not always going to be 100% clear to whoever's on the listening end. Those are the characteristics of language. What I'd also like to add is this idea called the triangle of meaning, because it helps explain some of the misunderstandings that occur in language use. And it works like this. A triangle, of course, has 3 points. In the triangle of meaning, on one point of the triangle is the symbol used. In this case, a word. Let's use car. On the second point of the triangle is the idea that the word represents. Now, this is where there are going to be variations among hearers. One person is going to imagine a Mustang, another person a Ferrari, another person a pickup, another person an old VW Bug. Whatever it might be, there are many, many, many different kinds of cars. And chances are that when I ask 100 people, when I use the word car for 100 people, the image that each of these 100 people conjure in their minds is probably going to be different. There might be some similarities across a couple of people. I might not get 100 different kinds of cars, but by and large, there are going to be a lot of different kinds of cars that people imagine. So this is where a lot of the misunderstanding comes into language, because people have different ideas for what certain words mean. On the third point of the triangle is the actual thing itself, whatever car it is that I'm talking about. It might be, for example, a 1992 red Ferrari, for example. So the triangle of meaning can help explain a lot of misunderstandings, primarily because in this second point, people have different perceptions of what words mean. And that is based in part on their co-cultural memberships and on their perceptual filters, which I talked about in Lecture 2 on intercultural communication. The next area of language to talk about in this lecture is the power of language. The first point here is that whatever we name something, it becomes. For example, if you see a barrel and it has the words toxic waste written on it, you are probably going to avoid that barrel like crazy. Now, in reality, the barrel might be empty. It might be full of diamonds. It might be full of crude oil. Who knows what's in the barrel? But the barrel says toxic waste. Therefore, to us, it's full of toxic waste. This is the same with people or with things. Whenever you call someone a name, that person, in everyone's mind, that person becomes that thing. So we have to wield the power of language very responsibly and very carefully. Language also gives us credibility, which is the degree that we are perceived to be trustworthy and competent. Credibility empowers us, and people assess our credibility with our language in conjunction with our nonverbal cues. It can give us credibility and lend people to believe us and trust us, or it can do the opposite. Language can be used to entertain through humor, to show indirectness through euphemisms, demonstrate group membership through slang, harm through libel, slander, and hate speech. More subtly, we can use language to create certain impressions in others about how we feel about someone or something. For example, if I'm using respectful words to speak with someone, that demonstrates that I have respect for this person. However, if I'm using disrespectful words and nonverbal cues to speak with someone, that demonstrates that I don't have a lot of respect for this person. And that brings me to the final area of this lecture, which is certain areas of language usage. The first one I want to talk about is the contradictor but. I love you, but. You're a great, but. You studied really hard, but. That but is the killer for a lot of us. Whatever comes after but, you know, we all know, is the actual truth that this person wanted to tell us. For example, I love you, but you smell bad. What are you going to hear? Are you going to hear the I love you part and pay attention to that? Or are you going to focus more on the but you smell bad part? For sure. If I were to flip that and say, you smell bad, but I love you, somehow it manages to lighten the impact of the pain of hearing those words, you smell bad, because it's placed in the first clause, not the second. So the I love you clause, because it's in the but clause, weighs more heavily than the first clause. In any case, using the word but can generate more trouble than it's worth in our relationships. If we can avoid using the word but, it's much better. We have to be a little bit creative. This is something that I work on all the time, and it's not like I have a good standard set of terms and words that I use in place of but. I don't. Every situation I have to rethink it, and I have to be creative. But I do put quite a bit of mental energy into avoiding the word but. And when I say the word but, I also mean its synonyms. However, though, although, conversely, on the other hand. Try to avoid use of the word but, as it will make your communications less offensive, much smoother, and much easier to receive. Finally, I want to talk about I versus you statements. There's been a large movement in the last couple of decades to replace you statements with I statements. So instead of saying, you always do this, you never do this, you never listen to me, you make me feel bad, the idea is to turn those around and use I statements. I feel bad when you do this. I don't like it when you do this. It's uncomfortable for me when you do this. When you do this, I feel like this. So to flip the subject to I from you. And there is great value in that because it lends the impression of not placing blame. However, if we use too many I statements, it gives the impression that we are egotistical and that we only care about ourselves. I don't like it when you do this. I feel like this when you do that. I am sad when you do this. I am hurt when you do this. A constant stream of I statements lends the impression of self-centeredness. So I'm not going to say don't use I statements. I'm not going to say don't use you statements. But I am going to say be aware of this and be cognizant of the fact that too many I statements lends the impression of being self-centered and not caring about your relational partner, but caring instead only about yourself. So there's a balance there. And I guess ultimately it's a matter of being very careful with the words that you choose to express whatever it is that you need to express. So be careful with your I statements and your you statements and with the use of but, and be aware of the words that you choose to use. All communications have a relational dimension as well as a regular communication dimension. So not only are you getting your point across directly, but every communication also influences the relationship. So be aware of that with the language that you choose to use and how you choose to get your points across.